Good afternoon. I'm going to make a video on one of my very favorite firearms. No, it's not a Glock, although I like those a lot. I am going to demonstrate one of my favorites. Now, to many of you, this may look like an ugly old gun. Why would anybody want to shoot it? Well, it's a Colt Single Action Army, if you don't already know that. It is a 6-shooter. However, you load 5. Generally speaking, you may have heard John Wayne say that. These guns date back to 1873. 1873, the first really successful cartridge pistol, I guess one could say. And it's been made continuously ever since, with just a few disruptions. In the 40s, due to the World War II, and some other things, and it picked back up in the early 50s. But other than that, this gun has been manufactured since 1873 and is still being manufactured today. You could go buy a brand new one today, right? With very few changes. Now this one happens to be an older one. It has a black powder frame. You take that little screw out and then pull the base pin out to get the cylinder, to remove the cylinder, black powder. This gun dates back to 1884, so one is supposed to fire only black powder in it, which is what I do when I fire it. I load black powder cartridges, as you might have seen in my lever gun tape video. So I'm not going to shoot this one today, but I thought I'd bring it out. It's kind of a historic old piece. Could have been carried by Wyatt Earp. Who knows? So I'll lay it down. It does have a 4 3/4 barrel. These guns came and still come in 3 barrel lengths. This is the shortest one, generally 4 3/4 inch. There's a newer one in that same length. That's the same gun, but this one was made in the 1980s, about 100 years later. See, it just looks a little cleaner and shinier. The only difference, not as worn. 4 3/4 inch barrel. Stepping on up to the next lengthened barrel, 5 1/2 inch. You see, of course, they come and came in nickel plate. That's a 5 1/2 inch barrel. You see the barrel just extends about 3/4 inch beyond the ejector rod housing there. Okay, it's one way you can spot that. This is probably the barrel length I see most often in westerns, I think. You see them all, but you see a lot of 5 1/2 inch barrels in the westerns. And then the 7 1/2 inch barrel. This was the original barrel length. When it came out in 1873, the U.S. Army adopted it in this barrel length. This was essentially the gun that the U.S. Army adopted in 1873, 45 Colt. Shoots a big cartridge. That's essentially the same bullet, 250 grain bullet, 45 long Colt. The only difference is these particular rounds are not loaded with black powder as they were back in the 1800s. Now, I have a lot of those and shoot a lot of those, but those are modern powder. But that's the configuration with very few changes. This gun was made in the 1950s. It's a second generation Colt, as they say, but same gun essentially. Stock grips. In the 50s, they came with this flat rubber grip. I tend to like the factory grips. I do switch them out occasionally, but that's it. Now, these are special old guns. When you pick up one of these, it just transports you back into the 1800s. It just really does. You notice they're single action. They're called single action because they won't fire unless you cock the hammer. Now, I can pull that trigger all day, and I'm probably more lackadaisical or likely have my hand and finger in the trigger guard with these guns. If the hammer's not cocked, first of all, I know the gun's not loaded. Unless it's cocked, and of course you can really see that pretty obviously, it's not going to fire. You can't make it fire. Okay? So, interesting guns. That's one reason when you see people twirling these things, it's not quite as dangerous. Even if it's loaded, I guess people do that or did that. I wouldn't do that. This gun is totally unloaded. I'll double check it. But when you spin it, you do that kind of stuff, you're not really endangering much. If even there are bullets in it, I wouldn't do that. But unless that hammer's cocked, it's just not going to fire. It can't fire. All right. So that's why it's a single action. Let's fire this thing. Okay. Let's start with a short barrel, 4 3/4 inch barrel. Now the way you load these, you half cock it, second click, that frees the cylinder. Okay. You put one round in, skip a chamber, then go 4 in a row. 1, 2, 3, 4. Close the loading gate. Bring the hammer all the way back. I'm going to let it fall. I have no earring protection on, but I know it's not going to fire. Click. Okay. That hammer fell on an empty chamber when you load it that way. You may have heard John Wayne explain that in a movie or two. But that's the way they loaded these old guns, with 5 rounds. Even though you have 6 chambers, you don't want that hammer resting on a live round, because if you were to drop it or hit that hammer, bang, you could have a surprise, right? So you load 5. It's ready to go. I'll use my big long holster here and stick it in that. But I'll take a few shots with them. Again, these are not precision instruments, but they're pretty accurate. They're pretty accurate. I don't know if I am today or not. Tell you what, I'll do something unusual here. I'll put my ear protection on. Almost forgot. You notice the little recoil, but they don't hurt. The gun rolls up in your hand very nicely. Now to unload the gun, you just do the same thing. You half cock it, you grab that ejection rod, punch them out into your hand. Very simple, it's unloaded. If you notice in the westerns, whenever they're loading, they're empty. They start wrestling with it, and you know, it's like they're having a fight with the gun to get it unloaded. Probably the actors really are not shooters, most of them, and they're not as familiar with how to unload them smoothly. But they really have a big wrestling match with their gun quite often. So that's the 4.5 inch barrel, or 4 3/4 inch barrel. Let's step up to the 5.5. Take a couple shots with it. Same thing, you know, it's put on half cock. 1 round in, skip a chamber. 1, 2, 3, 4. Close the loading gate, pull the hammer all the way back, click. We call that the John Wayne load. I doubt they called it the John Wayne load in the 1880s, however. They just called that the safe way to handle one of these guns. Let's take a couple shots with this one. Oh, there's a cowboy. I'm going to try long range. I'm just going out to 80 yards, see if I can come close to that big gong out there. So, even these old cowboy guns are accurate. Short, long range, except to hold them steady. Okay? Again, whenever you have these guns cocked, you always take them all the way back and then down. You never cock them halfway and then pull the trigger and take the hammer back down. Very hard on the mechanism. You don't want to do that. So it's always all the way back and then down, and you generally don't have any trouble with them. These guns, you put one of these in your hands, they feel like a glove, and they take you back into the 1880s. I mean, there's just nothing feels better than a good old Colt Single Action Army. They just handle so well. Beautiful gun. Okay, let's go to the long barreled gun now, the 7.5. Same thing, half cock, put a round in, skip a chamber. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I could put 6 in since I'm here on the range, but I'm not going to do that. I don't want to get in the habit of doing that. With the newer Ruger or Ruger Vaquero and some of the more modern actions, you can do that. You don't have the same issue. But with the old Colts or the Colt clones, that's the way you want to load them. Now, this one has a longer barrel, and it shoots right on. It's almost like my Model 29 44 mag. It will really drive nails if I'm holding it steady. But I'll just take a couple shots and see if I'm steady.